accepted an offer on your home. You're relieved and excited. Maybe you've already moved out, or at the very least, you're already mentally moved out. But then the appraisal comes back, and the number may be lower than your sale price. Suddenly, the deal feels like it's hanging on by a thread, and you're not even totally sure what to do about it, or what it means. For a lot of people selling their home, the appraisal is the part of the transaction that they understand the least, and it's the part that catches them most off guard when something goes sideways. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Hannah Garcia. I'm a realtor in the states of Wisconsin and Illinois, and this is my channel, Heartland Homes with Hannah. And as of May 2026, I've been selected for the Realtors Association of South Central Wisconsin's inaugural class of 40 under 40, which recognizes rising leaders in the real estate industry in this part of Wisconsin. So if you're thinking about selling your home and want to work with a rising leader in real estate, check the link in the description to set up a free consultation with me. Also in the description will be a link to the announcement that the association I belong to published. Today we're going all in on appraisals. What they are, how they work, what appraisers are really looking for when they walk through your home, all the things that come up with appraisals that can impact the transaction, and we'll be talking about how to get ahead of them. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series all about selling your home, everything from preparations to how best to price your home, as well as the other videos, I suggest you watch those before coming back to this one. Let's start from the beginning, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what an appraisal even is and who it's actually for. So let me define it. An appraisal is a professional opinion of a home's market value, completed by a licensed third-party appraiser, which, yes, an appraiser license is completely separate from a real estate license, and they usually work on behalf of the lender. It's their job to help the lender determine whether the property supports the amount of money being borrowed for the purchase. So when a buyer is financing the purchase, obviously meaning they're getting a mortgage for it, their lender requires an appraisal. From the standpoint of the institution is about to loan out a significant amount of money, and they want to make sure the home is really worth what they're being asked to finance. So they hire an independent licensed appraiser to go out and assess the value of the property. That's the thing to understand here. The appraisal is for the lender, not for you as the seller, and not exactly really for the buyer either. The lender is trying to make sure that they'll make their money back, that they're lending to the buyer. They're protecting their investment, and the appraisal is how they do that. So it's the appraiser's job to form an independent professional opinion of what the home is truly worth. And this is based on a number of things like its condition, its features, its location, what comparable homes in the area have recently sold for. You'll hear a real estate professional call those comps. The appraiser is not there to validate your sales price, and they're not there to tell you what a great home you have. They're trying to arrive at a defensible number based on evidence. And this is, understandably, where a lot of sellers get frustrated. Because in their mind, if a buyer was willing to pay that price, then obviously that means that's exactly what the home was worth. But the appraiser still has to be able to back that number up with comps. In most transactions, the buyer's lender orders the appraisal shortly after the offer is accepted. The buyer usually pays for it as part of their closing costs, but sometimes a buyer will ask for closing cost credits from you as the seller, so it's on the negotiation table most of the time. But either way, it's wrapped up into closing costs. And depending on how busy appraisers are in said area, the appraisal usually happens within the first couple of weeks of the transaction. As the seller, you don't really get a say in who the appraiser is. Lenders are required, like I said, to use independent appraisers, so they can't just handpick someone they think is going to magically hit the value that's needed for the deal to go through. Usually there's an appraisal management company, so if you ever hear someone say AMC, that's what they're referring to. But usually there's an AMC involved that assigns the appraisal order. What you can control is the condition and the presentation of your home when the appraiser walks through it. Clean, maintained home usually creates a very different impression than one that feels neglected or poorly prepared. Most residential appraisals are based heavily on comps. The appraiser looks at similar homes nearby that have sold recently and use those sales to help determine the value of your home. They use comps as reference points and start adjusting from there. If your home has an extra bathroom compared to another sale, that pushes the value upward. Is your lot smaller than a home that's recently sold? Well, then the price gets adjusted downwards. Is your roof newer than the comps? That'll definitely help you out. Are there things that need maintenance? Well, that can lower the price. So they're basically trying to figure out, based on what similar homes have recently sold for, where does this house realistically fall? Usually comps are homes that have been sold within the last 6 months all the way up to a year, and relatively close in proximity to the property itself. In a city, that is usually a pretty tight radius. But in more rural areas, appraisers sometimes have to pull from properties that are farther away because there simply isn't as many recent comparable sales to compare your house to. And in the opposite case, this is part of why appraisals can get tricky in really fast-moving markets. Appraisals are naturally a little backwards looking because they rely only on closed sales. So they can't pull from what's on the market now and what's for sale in the current market. They can only use properties that have been sold and the transaction has completely closed. So if prices in a neighborhood have been rising very quickly, sometimes buyers are willing to pay more than existing comps fully support at the time. That's a market where appraisal gaps tend to happen more often. Okay, so the appraiser shows up at your house. What is it exactly that they're looking at? They're pretty much looking at everything tied to the property itself. They're measuring square footage, looking at the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, checking the condition of major systems like the roof, the HVAC, plumbing, and electrical. They're looking at the basement, whether it's finished, the garage, the lot size, any other buildings on the property, like a shed and or an auxiliary dwelling unit. They're looking at the general conditions of the finishes throughout the house. They're pretty much looking at all of it. They take all of their observations into consideration, and then they assign an overall condition rating to the home. You may hear terms like C1 through C6 on an appraisal form. That's basically their way of categorizing how updated and well-maintained the property is. And this is where putting off maintenance that your home may need becomes an issue and does not play well in your favor. This is things like visible roof wear, water stains, peeling paint, cracked caulk, moisture issues in the basement. All of these things absolutely get noticed by an appraiser. Even smaller maintenance issues can start affecting how the overall condition of your home is viewed, which is also why I'm such a big fan of pre-listing inspections, which you'll know that if you've watched the series up until this point. A lot of the things an inspector is going to flag are the same things an appraiser is going to notice and take into consideration too. So if you've already addressed major issues before you list, you're usually walking into the appraisal process in a much stronger position. I talk a lot more in depth about pre-listing inspections in the preparations video of the series, so if you want to know more, like I said earlier, I suggest watching the earlier videos if you haven't already. So in short, yes, how well maintained your home is absolutely impacts how the property is perceived overall by the appraiser. Let's get into how any upgrades or renovations you may have made and how that will affect the appraised value. Appraisers absolutely do give some value for upgrades and renovations, but there's usually a limit to how much value they can realistically assign. And that limit comes from the surrounding market, like I've been saying. So for example, a finished basement can absolutely help value because you're adding square footage, and added square footage adds value to the home. A renovated kitchen may help value, but it's not as cut and dry as adding square footage would be. And you're way less likely to get your investment back dollar for dollar on a kitchen renovation versus some other upgrade that adds square footage to your home. Because if a nearby home with updated kitchens are only selling for, say, $20,000 more than homes with older kitchens, the appraiser usually can't justify giving more value to your home beyond that, regardless of how much the renovation costs you to complete. That's what I mean when I say things don't translate directly dollar for dollar for how much you spend on the upgrade versus how much you can charge for your home during the resale of it. You can't go into renovations thinking you'll always get back exactly the dollar amount that you put into it. Again, the appraisal is tied to what similar homes nearby have really sold for. So let's talk about what happens when the appraisal comes in lower than the agreed upon sale price, because this is usually part of the transaction that everybody starts getting stressed. Rightfully so. It's not a fun thing to deal with, but we can minimize stress as best as we can. So let's say your home is under contract for $400,000, but the appraisal comes back at $380,000. The lender is going to base the loan that they're giving to the buyer based off of the appraised value, not the contract price. So now there's a $20,000 gap that has to get figured out somehow. There are usually a few ways these situations get resolved. And all it really means is we're going back to the negotiation table. The buyer might decide to cover the entire difference that there is with their cash. So in this example, they'd bring an extra $20,000 to the closing on top of their down payment. In really competitive markets, some buyers waive the appraisal contingency up front in their original offer, which basically means they're agreeing ahead of time to potentially do exactly that, which is covering the appraisal gap. But obviously not every buyer has the ability or the desire to suddenly bring in a large amount of extra cash to the closing table. So you as a seller could also reduce the price down to the appraised value, or both sides meet somewhere in the middle. Maybe you as a seller drop the price a little bit and the buyer brings in some additional cash and everybody works together to keep the transaction alive. That happens a fair amount. And then there's another option that tends to go unnoticed for sellers, which is you have the option to contest the appraisal itself. Appraisers are professionals, but they're not infallible. They work with the data they have access to. And sometimes that data is incomplete. Maybe there was a recent sale that's very comparable to your home that they didn't include. Maybe one of the comps they used is actually a pretty poor comparable match to yours. Or maybe there's a better comp available. Maybe they made an error in the square footage. You as a seller have the right to request a reconsideration of value. This is not the same as calling the appraiser and arguing that your home is worth more because of how much you love it and this, that, and the other. No, it has to be factual. You, or more likely your agent, and this is one of those places where having a really good agent makes a huge difference, but your agent can pull comparable sales that the appraiser may have missed or underweighted. You can document that clearly and submit a formal request for reconsideration. Of course, it doesn't always work out, but it's worth a shot, especially when there's a legitimate comp that wasn't used. I've seen appraisals come up after a solid reconsideration request. Again, it's not always guaranteed to help, but I definitely want you to know that it's an option. If the reconsideration doesn't resolve it, buyer's agent can also request that a different appraiser be assigned, though the lender does not have to honor that request, and it can slow things down. The main thing I want you to take away here is that a low appraisal is not necessarily a dead end. It's a negotiation point, so stay calm, look at all your options, and try to work with the buyer as much as possible, because this is the point in the transaction that you both have a similar goal, which is just simply get to the closing table. Now, be workable, obviously to a reasonable degree. All right, now what can you do before the appraiser comes out to the house? First, you want your home in the absolute best condition possible. And if you've been following the rest of the seller series, a lot of this should already sound familiar. And again, as I said earlier in the video, a pre-listing inspection can take care of all the major issues ahead of time and can help a lot here. You also want to make sure that everything is easily accessible. If the appraiser needs to get in the attic, basement, utility room, garage, make sure that they can get into those areas. If something's blocked off or locked and they can't properly inspect it, that could create delays or complications. Yes, presentation still matters here to a degree. Appraisers are still people walking through a physical space, so bright, clean, organized is always going to have a good impression. Another thing you could do, and this is something I highly suggest doing, is put together a simple information sheet for the appraiser. Don't overcomplicate it, but create a list of major updates and improvements to the home with approximate dates if you know them. Things like when the roof has last had a replacement, the age of the HVAC, the age of the windows, electrical updates, whether there's been added square footage that might not be reflected in the county records, things like that. Because the appraiser doesn't automatically know the full history of the property, and having that information in front of them up front can help them and speed up the process. You can also include a few comparable sales that you and your agent feel are strong comps for the property. Of course, you're not telling the appraiser how to do their job, you're just making sure they have the most relevant information possible while they're evaluating the home. One thing I do want to clear up, because people mix these things up constantly, is the appraisal and the inspection are two completely different procedures. A home inspection is much more in-depth into the nitty-gritty of things, and the inspector is going to evaluate the actual condition of the house, and they're testing outlets, checking appliances, looking at the attic, foundation, the major systems, all of it, big and small. A good inspector can easily spend a few hours going through the property. An appraiser is there for different reasons. They're determining value. So while they absolutely pay attention to the condition and visible issues, they're not performing the same kind of deep mechanical inspection that the inspector is. The two can definitely overlap though. If an inspection uncovers major problems with all the things I keep listing, that can absolutely affect the appraisal. And this is another thing worth mentioning, is that cash transactions usually work a little differently. If a buyer is paying fully in cash, there's no lender involved, which means there usually isn't a required appraisal either. Now, a cash buyer can still choose to get an appraisal for their own information or peace of mind, and I probably would tell them if I were their realtor to go ahead and do that, but it's not mandatory the way it is with financed offers. So in a cash transaction, the sale price is really just whatever the buyer and the seller agree to. And this is part of why cash offers can be an appealing option to a seller. In a cash offer, there's one less thing that can potentially derail the deal halfway through the transaction. So if a seller receives two very similar offers, and one is cash while the other is financed, the cash offer is often viewed as the lower risk option overall. And for anybody watching who isn't selling right now but is thinking about refinancing, the appraisal process works similarly in the refinancing process too. The lender still wants to confirm that the home's value before approving the refinance, so they'll order an appraisal the same way you would during the sale of your home. A lot of the same advice still applies. Make the home accessible, have documentation ready for major improvements, and if you've done any significant updates to the property, it helps to have a simple list prepared ahead of time. There are also a few things that can affect appraised value that the seller doesn't always think about right away. One is the specific location of the property itself. Not just the neighborhood overall, but things like, is it next to a busy road, backing up to a commercial property? Is there traffic noise, a lack of privacy, things like that location-wise. On the flip side, the inverse is true. Homes on quieter streets, cul-de-sacs, property with good views, walkability, or strong outdoor spaces can sometimes benefit and have an increased appraised value. Lot size can matter quite a bit too, depending on the market, especially in a lot of the Wisconsin and Illinois suburbs. Large lots or usable outdoor space can help with the value of your home compared to nearby homes with smaller yards. Another thing that comes up surprisingly often is square footage discrepancies. Sometimes county records don't fully reflect additions, finished spaces, or basement work that was done later on. And if the square footage numbers don't match up properly, obviously that's going to affect the assigned value, which is why I stressed earlier the importance of having all of your ducks in a row in a easily accessible packet for the appraiser, and also why having permits and accurate records is vital when major work has been done to the home. And then there's something called functional obsolescence, which is basically appraisal language for layout issues that make a home less practical for everyday living. Examples of that are perhaps a bedroom is only accessible through another bedroom. Maybe a bathroom placement feels hard to get to. Or maybe the floor plan just functions strangely compared to the surrounding homes. Even if the finishes are beautiful, layout issues can still affect the appraised value of any home. Appraisals don't happen in a vacuum, as I've said. The overall market plays a huge role on how appraisals play out. In super competitive markets, where homes are getting multiple offers quickly and sale prices are regularly coming in above asking price, appraisals can struggle to keep up. You may not realize that the only data appraisers can use for assigning value is only from sales that have already closed, which can lag behind where prices are moving in real time. It's also why buyers in highly competitive markets sometimes waive appraisal contingencies up front to make their offers stronger. Any buyers out there watching this video, I wouldn't necessarily advise a buyer to do this unless they fully understand what that means they're agreeing to. If a buyer waives the appraisal contingency in their offer, it means they're agreeing to cover the entire gap if the appraisal comes in low, which is great on the seller side, of course, if a buyer decides to do that. But if you're selling your home, I want you to be prepared if buyers do have appraisal contingencies. It basically means that if there are any appraisal discrepancies, they reserve the right to back out of the transaction. Of course, I'm not saying don't accept offers that include appraisal contingencies, but I want you to have all the information and be as informed as you can be. In slower, more balanced markets, appraisals tend to be a little more straightforward because pricing is moving less aggressively overall. Knowing what's going on in your market going into the process of selling, so knowing what's been selling, how fast, and at what price relative to asking. That's part of how your agent should be preparing you before you even list. But if you've priced aggressively high in softer markets, the appraisals where that can come back around to bite you in the ass. Appraisals are one of those parts of the selling process that can feel completely out of your hands. And in some ways, they absolutely are. And you can't control what the market data says, but you can control how prepared you are, how well maintained your home is, and how well you and your agent handle it if the number comes in somewhere that you didn't expect. The sellers who feel blindsided by appraisals are usually the ones who didn't know what to expect going in. And that's something that's fixable. That's exactly what these videos are for. So if you've been following along with this series, we did the preparations video, the pricing video, the home improvement video, and now this one. You're already thinking about the sale of your home in a more complete way than most sellers do. If you're thinking about selling in Wisconsin or Illinois and want to hire a rising leader in real estate, someone with recognition from their local association, then check the link in the description to book a consultation with me. As always, the consultation is completely free, and if this video helped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn your notifications on so you never miss a video from me. We've got 2 more videos in the seller series, so stay tuned. Up next, we'll be talking about negotiations, and then finally, getting to the closing table. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.